King Edward II of England is often remembered as a weak, ineffective ruler whose personal life was defined by scandal and failure. History often claims he died in prison, perhaps of natural causes or illness, shortly after being deposed by his own queen. That is the convenient lie the medieval chroniclers were forced to record. The terrifying truth, whispered in the deepest shadows of Berkeley Castle, is that Edward II was brutally, agonizingly murdered by his wife's agents in a political assassination so cruel and bizarre that it became the defining horror of the Plantagenet dynasty. The method was specifically chosen to inflict maximum silent pain while leaving no external marks that could implicate the queen. The murder was an act of cold-blooded political necessity orchestrated by his treacherous wife, Queen Isabella, the she-wolf of France, and her powerful lover, Roger Mortimer. They used a terrifying, crude, but highly effective torture method to guarantee the king's death was both agonizing and deniable. The greatest secret of the Plantagenet crown is that the most horrific political assassination in English history was carried out with a simple household item that was heated to a terrifying temperature. Don't you dare look away. Watch this entire deep dive documentary and subscribe to Crown of Dread, and you will learn the one shocking record that proves the Queen herself issued the cryptic, murderous command to her agents. The seeds of the king's brutal end were sown by his perverse obsession with his handsome favorites. A scandal that permanently crippled his reign. Edward II's political failures were inextricably linked to his controversial, obsessive relationships with his male favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston, and later, Hugh Despenser the Younger. These relationships were not just personal, they were political poison. Edward II showered his favorites with immense power, titles, and wealth, elevating them above the powerful, established English nobility. This practice enraged the barons, who viewed the favorites as arrogant, low-born interlopers who held too much influence over the crown. The favorites were not just political rivals. They were seen as personal and social insults to the English aristocracy. The king's blatant disregard for traditional heterosexual marriage and his obsessive attachment to these men provided the perfect political justification for the barons to rise in rebellion. The issue of the favorites became the rallying cry for a massive civil war that eventually cost Edward II his throne. This situation illustrates the terrifying historical reality of using personal life as a political weapon. The barons weaponized the king's personal preferences to justify the destruction of his power, proving that a ruler's private life can be the most potent tool for his enemies. But the most devastating betrayal came from the woman sworn to love and honor him, his own wife, Queen Isabella. Queen Isabella of France, the daughter of the powerful French king Philip IV, was initially loyal to Edward II. But years of the king's neglect, public humiliation, and obsessive favoritism finally pushed her into a brutal, political alliance with the opposition. Isabella was sent to France in 1325 on a diplomatic mission. While there, she openly began a highly scandalous, political, and romantic affair with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron and a sworn enemy of the king. This relationship was the ultimate act of treason, turning the queen into the direct, military enemy of her own husband. Isabella and Mortimer used French support and political legitimacy to organize an invasion force. Their goal was simple: depose Edward II, place their young son, Edward III, on the throne, and rule England as regents. The queen, who had been publicly humiliated by the king's lavish devotion to his male favorites, now sought absolute, devastating revenge. This historical scandal illustrates the principle of betrayal as a political necessity. Isabella proved that when a ruler's neglect or cruelty becomes absolute, the neglected spouse becomes the most motivated and dangerous conspirator, turning intimate betrayal into a decisive act of statecraft. But the true depth of the king's shame was revealed in the terrifying hidden motive for his final imprisonment. Edward II was captured by Isabella and Mortimer's forces in 1327 and immediately forced to abdicate his throne in favor of his son. But his imprisonment was not meant to be permanent. It was a terrifying political instrument. The deposed king was shuffled between several remote castles, including Berkeley Castle, always kept in complete isolation. This was done to prevent any loyalist barons from attempting a rescue. The Queen and Mortimer needed Edward II to be alive, but silenced and suffering for a brief period to legitimize their regency. However, the mere fact of his existence, the living, breathing symbol of the previous regime, was a constant threat. The Queen and Mortimer feared that a successful rescue or a shift in public opinion could instantly revive the deposed king's cause. The solution had to be permanent, silent, and politically deniable. This situation illustrates the terrifying historical problem of managing a deposed tyrant. Edward II's continued existence was a massive vulnerability, proving that in totalitarian politics, the symbolic survival of the previous regime is often more dangerous than any army. But the most gruesome detail of the conspiracy was the chilling, cryptic command the Queen's agents received before the murder. With Edward II's continued existence proving a massive political liability, Isabella and Mortimer made the inevitable, brutal decision: assassination. The Queen's agents, two hardened criminals named Thomas Gurney and William Ogle, received the chilling, cryptic order for the murder. The murder order was deliberately vague, sent via a chilling Latin-coded message to the king's jailers. The command was famously translated by some historians as Edwardum occidere nolite timere bonum est, which translates to Edward to kill, fear not good it is. The comma placement was crucial. Depending on where the jailer chose to read the comma, the message could mean, do not fear to kill Edward, it is a good thing. Or, do not kill Edward, it is good to fear. This ambiguity was a brilliant, terrifying political maneuver. It guaranteed that the Queen and Mortimer could deny direct involvement while ensuring the jailers understood their true intent. The executioners were forced to assume the deadliest interpretation, knowing the penalty for failure would be their own agonizing death. We have traced the terrifying command, but the final, most horrifying secret is the actual execution method chosen by the assassins to silence the king forever. The successful invasion led by Queen Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer, was swift and devastating. It exposed the complete lack of loyalty Edward II commanded among his own barons. But the subsequent rule of Isabella and Mortimer was defined by a terrifying, absolute cynicism. Immediately after seizing power, Mortimer effectively became the de facto ruler of England, making the young Edward III a mere puppet. Mortimer ruthlessly confiscated the vast estates and titles of all loyalist barons who had supported Edward II, enriching himself and his conspirators to an unprecedented degree. This was a naked, brutal power grab disguised as a liberation. Mortimer's reign of terror was absolute. He employed a network of spies and informants, executing anyone who dared question his authority or the legitimacy of the new regime. The entire kingdom lived under the shadow of the man who had slept with the queen and stolen the crown. This is a chilling historical precedent for authoritarian rule following a coup. Mortimer showed that revolutionary change often results not in liberty, but in the rapid, brutal replacement of one tyrant with another, proving that political greed is the only constant in power struggles. But the most shocking secret of the conspiracy was the final, terrifying act of desperation: the king's public plea to the court that was ruthlessly ignored. Before his assassination, Edward II was subjected to a final, profound act of public humiliation. He was forced to formally abdicate his throne in favor of his son, Edward III. This was not a negotiation. It was a terrifying political ritual. Agents of Isabella and Mortimer burst into the king's prison chamber, forcing him to witness a formal ceremony where the Chief Justice broke his staff of office, symbolizing the final dissolution of the king's authority. Edward II, facing immediate death, was forced to read a formal statement, weeping uncontrollably, agreeing to surrender his title. The act was a political necessity for the Queen and Mortimer, as it provided a veneer of legality for their seizure of the crown. Edward II was stripped of his sacred regality, his divine right replaced by his profound public shame. This moment is the ultimate historical example of manufactured legitimacy. The Queen and Mortimer showed that controlling the narrative of the transfer of power, forcing the tyrant to legitimize his own fall, is essential for any successful coup, a tactic used by regimes to manage public opinion. But the true source of Edward II's fate was a devastating letter found by Mortimer, a document that proved the king was too dangerous to be kept alive. The living King Edward II was a massive political liability. A small, successful plot by loyalists to restore him could have instantly plunged England into civil war, destroying the newly established power base of Isabella and Mortimer. Historians have long debated the definitive moment Isabella and Mortimer decided on assassination. The consensus points to the interception of a secret letter from a loyalist baron, detailing a detailed, imminent plan to rescue Edward II from his prison at Berkeley Castle. This letter was the final death warrant. Mortimer, realizing that keeping the king alive posed an unacceptable existential threat, sent the chilling, cryptic order to the jailers, the Edwardum occidere nolit timere bonum est message. The executioners were given the signal: kill the king immediately, silently, and in a way that left no physical evidence of external foul play. This situation illustrates the terrifying historical principle of risk assessment in tyranny. Isabella and Mortimer showed that political violence is often a cold, calculated response to eliminate a specific, measurable risk, proving that self-preservation dictates the most brutal choices. But the method chosen for the king's execution was not a sword. It was a bizarre, agonizing ritual designed to destroy him with fire from within. The murder of Edward II in September 1327 is one of the most chilling acts of private political assassination in European history. The executioners, Thomas Gurney and William Ogle, chose a horrifying, unique method designed to fulfill the political mandate: kill the king agonizingly, but leave no external marks. The executioners restrained the deposed king in his prison cell. They used a specially prepared metal instrument, a poker or spit, which was heated to a terrifying, glowing, red-hot temperature. This instrument was then thrust internally into the king, ensuring his organs were burned and destroyed, but leaving the outside of the body intact. The goal was complete internal destruction. The king died in unimaginable agony, his terrifying screams reportedly echoing across the castle grounds, heard by nearby residents. The screams were the final physical testimony to the sheer brutality of the assassination. This horrifying act demonstrates the ultimate historical expression of calculated, deniable cruelty. The Queen and Mortimer showed that political murder is often prioritized over human decency, with the aim being to inflict maximum pain while maintaining a facade of legality. But the final shocking piece of evidence that proved the assassination was the unique odor the king's body emitted after his death. The assassins achieved their goal. The king's body was externally unmarked, allowing the queen to claim Edward II died of a sudden illness or shame. However, the murder left a single, inescapable piece of evidence: the odor. The intense, unnatural, pervasive smell of burned internal flesh emanating from the king's corpse was unique and undeniable. The royal embalmers and local castle staff who handled the body immediately understood that the king had not died naturally. The smell was the final, unsuppressible witness to the brutal murder. The executioners were paid handsomely, and the queen quickly ordered the king's body to be moved and buried in secrecy to suppress the evidence of the odor. Despite all the political maneuvering and the careful staging of the crime, the smell of treason was the one thing the Queen and Mortimer could not fully control. This illustrates the terrifying historical truth that physical reality defies propaganda. The Queen could dictate the history books, but she could not hide the physical evidence of her crime, proving that the truth always leaves a trace, no matter how hard the state tries to suppress it. We have traced the terrifying betrayal and the gruesome execution. But the darkest secret remains, the bizarre ritual his own soldiers performed over his body to ensure their political survival. Following the silent, agonizing murder, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer faced the critical task of managing the corpse. They needed to present the deposed king's death as a tragic but natural event, a death caused by shame or illness incurred during his imprisonment. Edward II's body was moved to Gloucester Cathedral for burial, where it was laid in state. This public ceremony was a brilliant final act of political theater. The official line was that the king had died of natural causes. The body was carefully prepared by embalmers to hide any signs of external struggle, but the internal damage remained their terrifying secret. The magnificent funeral, complete with a beautiful effigy, was designed to erase the memory of the weak, deposed king and replace it with the image of a respectable, deceased monarch. The Queen and Mortimer needed this solemnity to legitimize the rule of the young Edward III. This situation illustrates the chilling historical precedent of state control over public grief. Isabella and Mortimer showed that an effective regime dictates not only how a ruler lives, but also how he is mourned, using propaganda to control national emotion and maintain power. But the true cost of the murder was paid not by the king, but by his wife's lover, a betrayal that guaranteed his public execution. Roger Mortimer, the man who had slept with the Queen and masterminded the assassination, briefly became the most powerful man in England. But his power, built on murder and arrogance, was destined to collapse. Mortimer became arrogant, ruthlessly seizing titles and wealth and ruling the young Edward III with an iron fist. The young king, now coming of age, resented Mortimer's control and the dishonor brought upon his family. In a daring, sudden coup in 1330, Edward III personally led a raid on Nottingham Castle, capturing Mortimer in the Queen Mother's own chambers. Mortimer was swiftly tried and executed for treason, and his execution was designed to be public and brutal. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most agonizing and humiliating form of medieval execution. The Queen, betrayed by her lover, was forced to live out her days under house arrest. This is the ultimate historical truth of power consuming the usurper. Mortimer showed that those who seize power through political murder are rarely safe, proving that when the symbolic authority of the crown is restored, the revenge is absolute and terrifying. But the most shocking fact about the murder was the single most convincing piece of evidence that proved the king was killed in agony: a letter found centuries later. For centuries, the true nature of Edward II's death remained a dark, persistent rumor. The convenient story of illness was the official record. But in the 20th century, a single critical document was discovered in an Italian archive, confirming the full, agonizing horror of the murder. The letter, written by an official named Manuel Fieschi to Edward III, detailed the full, shocking truth of the king's death. Fieschi confirmed that Edward II was not killed by natural causes, but was murdered by the Queen's agents using a red-hot iron poker inserted internally. The method was specifically chosen to leave no marks on the skin. This document, the Fieschi letter, is considered the definitive historical confirmation of the brutal assassination. It proves that the rumors of the terrifying torture were true, and that the English monarchy successfully suppressed this knowledge for over 600 years. This illustrates the terrifying power of hidden archives. The Fieschi letter showed that historical truth can survive centuries of state censorship, proving that the full reality of political crimes can eventually be revealed by persistent investigation. But the final disturbing secret of the investigation was the ultimate fate of the chief assassin, Thomas Gurney, a fate that exposed the limits of the Queen's power. The chief assassin, Thomas Gurney, the man who delivered the final agonizing blow, was initially rewarded and then immediately forced into hiding by the chaotic politics of the new regime. When Edward III seized power, Gurney became a priority target. He was hunted across Europe by the young king's agents, fearing that Gurney's confession would permanently disgrace the Queen Mother and destabilize the throne. Gurney was finally apprehended in Naples, but before he could be brought back to England to confess, he died mysteriously at sea. The official story was that Gurney died of a sudden illness. However, historical consensus suggests Gurney was silenced by agents of the English crown, preventing him from providing testimony that could implicate the Queen Mother, Isabella, and the high-ranking officials who sanctioned the murder. The true killer was sacrificed to save the royal image. This demonstrates the historical reality of tyranny eliminating its own agents. The crown showed that those who commit the state's most brutal crimes are rarely safe, proving that political expediency demands the elimination of all witnesses once the job is done. We have witnessed the betrayal, the gruesome murder, and the ultimate revenge. Now, for the final critical verdict. We must confront the ultimate cost of this political crime. We have unsealed the horrifying secrets of King Edward II, the ultimate betrayal by his own queen, the agonizing assassination by the red-hot iron, the ruthless consolidation of power by Mortimer, and the spectacular public revenge exacted by Edward III. The assassination was a desperate political act, proving that in medieval England, the crown was a prize worth any betrayal. The silence of the grave was the final weapon used to erase the memory of the king's terrible end. We have revealed the entire horrifying truth. But now, we turn the final question to you, the crown of dread audience. Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer ordered the horrific torture murder of Edward II, but the assassination prevented a political civil war and secured the smooth transition of power to Edward III, who became a popular and successful king. Does the ultimate success and stability that resulted from this brutal act of regicide morally justify the agonizing method and the crime itself? Let the world know your verdict. Drop your opinion in the comments below. Subscribe to Crown of Dread for more hidden history. And find the truth buried beneath the oldest thrones.